Welcome to another Ideas That Matter conversation, except this is a reversed one. So I've had Davood Gozli on before for a conversation where we talked about a lot of really interesting things having to do with philosophy, dialogue, and as a matter of fact, we've been on each other's things in the past. You could say we've been crossing virtual paths for a while, but this is where the former guests get to be the interviewers and I wind up being the interviewee. So I'm just going to turn it over to Davood and you get to be the host and I'll be the guest and you just
Nice.
fire away with whatever it is that you want to talk about.
Great, great. Thanks again, Greg, for having me. I'm very excited, and hopefully, I'll voice out some of the questions that they're not just my questions, but questions that your audience, especially audiences that have been following you for some years. I've been following your content, your YouTube channel since 2000, at least 2016,
Okay.
and maybe before that. But so one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about your project, which is really an online educational project that has multiple facets, I think about for the lack of better term, uh, brand,
Oh yeah.
which is your description. It's very fair description. I think very accurate, which is making complex philosophical ideas accessible to general audiences. So I wanted to ask you, since you've been doing it for a number of years, how has your thoughts on this have changed over the years?
Oh.
Have you changed your attitude, the way you think about any of those? Like there are several elements in that statement: the complexity of ideas, the philosophical ideas, accessibility, general audience. So my first question would be about how your thinking has changed about that, the tagline, that brand.
Yeah, I mean if it has changed, it's done so without me choosing to do it or planning it or thinking in any like coherent way about it. I'm sure it has probably changed, but in ways that I haven't thematized at all. I mean, the complex things, so philosophical ideas are typically pretty complex. I don't want to suggest that as some people like to do, oh, they're just very simple. We can explain them, very easily boil them down so that nobody has to think about them at all. And you can just kind of like bullet point them. I don't think that's quite right. And I think there is kind of like an art to taking those sorts of ideas and being familiar with them and kind of, hanging out with them for a while and then thinking about how would I actually explain these to somebody who isn't perhaps as interested in them or doesn't have the same sort of background or could be coming from a different professional background, like explain them to business people or nursing students or engineers.
Hmm.
So I think that stayed the same. And I know that I had an advantage that I think some people would consider in other respects a disadvantage in that my entire teaching career, which now is, I think I'm in like my 25th or 26th year, I've been teaching non-philosophy majors and I've been teaching mostly, I've taught some upper level classes, but mostly, the things that we call service classes like intro to philosophy, ethics, business ethics, critical thinking. So I'm teaching people who typically don't want to be there or are afraid of what philosophy would be. They're intimidated by it. And I'm trying to take these texts and thinkers and say, hey, there's some cool stuff here that you can actually understand and use. And I always approach my students, and I guess I think you could say I approach the audience without thinking that there are a bunch of dummies that need things oversimplified for them. I think that the ordinary person, if you explain things in the right way, which means sometimes like asking them questions. This is something you're actually very good at, was having dialogue with people and getting them to like thoughtfully pause. I'm much more like, let's move ahead, but you've got some, good pauses in the way that you do things. And I need to do a bit more of that. sort of sitting with questions. But you approach people as if, listen, you can understand this stuff. It is difficult and it is tricky,
Mm.
but it's not beyond you. And it's almost like there's a feedback loop that gets created. People, if they have the idea that you're not talking down to them and you're not treating them as if they're children, and you have confidence that they can understand it, they kind of rise to the occasion.
Mhm.
And they may not, like, on the first pass fully understand Kant's critique of pure reason or something very difficult like that, but they get it, and there's enough there that they respond in kind of a positive way, and then that comes back to me, and then I go back to them, and it
Mhm.
works out that way. If you do the opposite and you're like, listen, dummies, there's no way you can understand this stuff, I'm here to explain it all to you, well, you establish a very different dynamic, a hierarchical one
Right.
that
Right.
says, you should be so lucky if you ever make it to my level.
Right. Right.
And I think that turns a lot of people off, rightly so. I mean, when people talk to me that way, I don't like it.
I think that the people who operate based on the assumption of inaccessibility, that what I'm
Mm,
talking about is inaccessible to you, I think what they end up doing is necessarily a kind of performance. So they're performing. They're there to
yeah, yeah.
perform, and you can enjoy my performance, but you can never be like me. You can never actually have direct contact with these ideas.
Yeah,
So
unless you're
yeah,
like the lucky one who I'll pick out of the audience and pull up on stage and
right,
say, "You
right,
could be my apprentice," right?
yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think one of the ways that philosophy screwed itself over in both analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, really from about the 1960s through, let's say, the 1990s, and I think it's still going on today, is exactly what you're calling inaccessibility. People, when there was lots and lots of money for philosophy departments, philosophers could afford to be like, oh, you want to study philosophy, oh, that's not for you, you English majors, or, and you may have encountered this, psychology majors or economics majors, we think the really important thoughts, and if you do that sort of thing, then no big surprise when money gets tight and people are like, well, can you justify us paying you? And you're like, oh, well, we think really important thoughts. And they're like, well, there really isn't a budget for that anymore.
Mm,
We're not just going to take your word for it. What do you
mhm,
actually produce? But if you can say, listen, thinking about this sort of stuff might help you have better relationships, or not be taken in so easily by things that you see on the media, or you can think more considerately about where you want to go in life and whether the career that you're pursuing is actually a good one or not. I mean, that's stuff that hits people right where they are. And
mhm,
and there's a lot of need for explaining things in a accessible way to everybody who's faced with like ethical dilemmas, you
mm.
know, in say nursing or business or engineering or military situations, or pick anything that you want.
Sure, sure. There are two aspects in your two parts of your question that I'd like to highlight. Um, One of them is that to say that I'm going to make these ideas accessible the way you do it is, to a large extent, it's about showing how they are already accessible or more accessible than the audience might think at first. So
Yeah,
let me show you. Give me a chance so I can show you. And another part of it is not intellectual access, but care. That showing people, other people, that you can care, and you're already in a position in your life that you can care about these ideas.
yeah, yeah.
They're not foreign to you, or they are not completely irrelevant or purely institutional, purely disciplinary ideas.
And you're not just like playing a game with them either. They
Right.
they matter. Yeah, I think that's quite good. Yeah, I like that idea about. And I mean, it's almost in a way going back to Plato and the notion of bringing the knowledge out of the student. I'm not going to like say I buy into the entire doctrine of recollection or anything, but there is, what you're bringing out of the student is their capacities to understand and, like you said, to care to grasp the value of
Mhm.
these things that we're studying. So they could study Schopenhauer, who, by the way, is a good writer, and I think is a lot easier to read than, say, Kant, who's not a good writer. Um, and you could say, okay, well, why do I care about whether the basis of ethics is egoism or malice or compassion? Well, you want to know which is you to begin with, right? Are you
Mhm.
are you thinking you're a compassionate person because everybody tells you that's such a good thing to be, but really you're not? How would you become compassionate or more compassionate? What would it look like? Um, those sorts of matters, I think a lot of
Mhm.
people could grasp onto, and yeah, there's something within them that makes these things possible for them. Schopenhauer's not a different species of human being than you or I or the average person on the street is.
Yes. Yes. And he shares a lot of the problems that we have, personal, especially problems
Yeah.
in personal life.
Yeah, he was kind of a piece of work.
That's yeah, that's
Have
yeah.
you ever read that letter that his mother wrote him?
I vaguely remember. Was it about complaining, like he was being rude, or in
Well, not just being rude, but that he typically is rude. She said, "You're a really smart guy, but you're kind of a prick, you
mm,
know, and people really would like you a lot more if you weren't such a prick." I mean, she doesn't say it in those terms, but that's how we would frame it today. And here's another part of the puzzle. She's like, "I don't understand why you think that you have to be that way. You actually don't. And life would be so much easier for you if you weren't constantly complaining about other people."
mhm, mhm. But in some ways, I've always thought that it's kind of lucky for some of us to be able to initially identify with these philosophical figures on those
Oh yeah,
superficial bases, like hearing that Schopenhauer didn't get along, and the possibility that not getting along with people maybe was reflected in some way indirectly on his philosophy
yeah,
or directly. And it would be a nice entryway. It's like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. I also don't get along usually with other people. So let's see what he has to say on that experience.
yeah. And in my case, I actually did have a mom. She didn't write it in a note, but she did say those sorts of things to me because I was kind of a prick, you know.
Mm,
And
yeah.
I was very smart, and there was a correlation between those. And actually, I can see that with one of my kids too, who's very smart and tests very highly, and of course thinks that they're better than everybody else because
Mm,
of that. And when you project that to other people, they don't like it. Surprise, surprise.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then it sets up kind of bad dynamics.
And we're not necessarily wrong when we come to those judgments.
Yeah. Well, not wrong entirely, but maybe wrong in how it's framed or how we draw something out of it.
Or maybe how much its truth value is always always there. How true it
Right.
is all the time in all situations. Maybe we overgeneralize based on limited experiences.
Yeah.
Uh,
Something I was thinking about as you were talking about this is so much in, and not just philosophy, but really any intellectual endeavor, how so much of it is so contingent. And philosophy, maybe more than others, presents itself as like the realm of necessity. Things have to be this way and this way and this way, but so much is contingent. Why do we even read Schopenhauer at all? Because he was lucky enough to wind up in Berlin, to not lose his job over being a jerk to Hegel, who just kind of looked at him as a weird eccentric. His people didn't read his stuff much, and then there was kind of like a Schopenhauer resurgence, and then he kind of fell out of favor, and now people are reading a lot of his stuff again. I mean, all of this stuff is very, very contingent, and a lot of times we can actually find not exactly the same thoughts, but similar thoughts in a lot of different people. And we could say, well, you didn't have to get this from Schopenhauer. You could have gotten this from this other person or this other person. You just don't know them.
mhm.
Um, but maybe in some other time, people won't be reading Schopenhauer and they'll be reading this other person instead, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, let's go back. Allow me to go back to
Sure.
that initial idea of making philosophical ideas accessible to a general audience. I was also wondering whether there are aspects of your work that don't neatly fit into that description, even though a lot of it does.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
are there remainders that are left out when you give that description of what you do?
there's because I do a number of different things, there's definitely parts of what I do that might not even be all that philosophical. You know, I'm really into heavy metal music, and me and my friend Scott Cerulli, we do this classic metal class. And then I talk about, you know, metal in other venues as well.
Mm.
And sometimes it's very philosophical, like when we're thinking about, you know, when does a band cease to be the same band? It's kind of a metaphysical issue, ship of Theseus question. Okay, that's directly philosophical. But when I'm like talking about, you know, the rise of metal in Germany in the 1970s, with, you know, particularly the Scorpions, and by the end of the 70s Accept and stuff like that. I mean, there could be some philosophical dimensions to it, but I'm usually not doing anything directly philosophical. And, you know, similarly with the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series, um sometimes, you know, I'll talk about, you know, so like Robert Howard's Conan character, is he an
Mhm.
existentialist hero? Okay, that's philosophical. But, you know, Conan hating wizards and, you know, preferring to slash them up and being lucky enough to figure out how to break their spells, that there's probably not much philosophical about that, you know.
Mhm.
And then I have, like, you know, I do the Sadler stories.
That's right. Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Yeah, and so you know, some of them are having to do with philosophy, right?
Mhm.
But a lot of them, like the latest one that I released, was about this hamster that we had as not as kids, I wouldn't say, because I was already out of the army and going to college. I, you know, as a young 20 something, um, you know, could you like find some philosophical points in it? Sure, but I'm not talking philosophy, you know.
But
So
they could be, especially the Sadler stories. They could be. I think maybe this
you,
would be an argument, but I think they could be starting points of.
you know, I think it's actually good, for somebody who has sort of a public persona, like in philosophy,
Mhm.
to not be Mr. Philosophy all the time, because I do actually get people. So I'll say things about something, and then people say weird responses like, "Oh, you must, you know, what would Hegel say about this?" And I'll be like, "Hegel doesn't care about, you know, me having a hamster, or, you know, liking certain kinds of beer or stuff like that. It doesn't have to be philosophy all the time." You know?
That's
And
perfect.
I
Yeah.
think that that's some people have the idea, you know, Lev Shestov has this really great passage where he talks about people's misconception of being a literary author. I don't know if you've ever read it in
No.
All Things Are Possible. It's really funny. I mean, and he's a funny, funny guy. So he says, you imagine you have an incorrect inference, which is, I love reading this stuff. You know, if reading it is so great, producing it must be even better. And he says, it's exactly the opposite. When you're trying to write something, I mean, you know, you've written books. So when you're trying to write something, it's nerve wracking. You're not, you second
It's
guess
messy.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, very messy. You know, you've got like a lot of thoughts. Sometimes you write them down on note cards, or, you know, we use electronic things, and you can't keep them all in your head. And you're like, am I even on the right track with this sort of stuff?
Yeah.
And
Sometimes deleting pages.
yeah,
Pages of written.
and or sometimes you may even lose something. You lose a word perfect file, or a word file, and you're like, oh crap, there goes
That's
that.
right.
You know,
Yeah.
now I have to reconstitute it. Hope I've got all the stuff stuck in my head, but I don't know if I do.
Mhm.
And you know, so people think, oh, it's going to be awesome when I meet the great author, because their whole life is like living in the realm of ideas. And then you get there, and they're wearing their pajamas and, you know, smoking a cigarette and drinking coffee, coffee and they haven't shaved, and you're like, who is this guy?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, philosophy or literature with him. And you find out they only want to talk about farming or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The work is, yeah, we don't appreciate that the work has a sort of independence from the author, and the author is not like a super work. It's not the author is not like the tree from which those fruits are
Yeah, it's a
falling
good way to
down.
put it. Yeah. I mean, it would be weird if they were, right?
But what
Um,
what you're describing is really great because you are, again, going back to the language of business and marketing. What in the business world people would urge us to be on brand all the time
oh, right.
and to
Yeah.
actually limit ourselves.
Yeah.
So there's actually Slavoj Žižek has an interview in which somebody asks him about his, I think, childhood, and he says, "I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to remember. I just want to be this Hegel guy, Hegel and Lacan. Just ask me about theory. I don't want to interact at a personal level, talking about." So he kind of refused
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting.
to open up a personal topic of discussion.
Yeah.
But what you're doing is you're intentionally going off brand for the sake of, I think what it does is it humanizes the project. It has a kind of humility in it, and it ultimately serves the philosophical project by not um, overinflating it or by making it turning it into a false promise of.
Yeah. It keeps philosophy as important, but as just part of life rather than the totality of life. Right.
Right, right.
Another one that just occurred to me is so I do things with cats. I volunteer at this cat shelter, and I used to post a lot of pictures of Sassy while she was still alive.
Mhm.
And so obviously I enjoy cats, right? As do you. I mean, your
Yeah,
cat
yeah.
was
There's a
just
cat
on.
behind me right now.
Yeah. Well, at the very beginning, he was like peering up and
That's
watching the screen. And it's interesting because I'll post stuff every once in a while about cats, and you get people, and I'm not going to say they're weirdos, but their responses are weirdos. First, they'll like mention, I guess John Gray has a book about philosophy and cats, and they'll be
yeah,
like, "Have you read John Gray's Philosophy and Cats?" And I'll be like, "I don't want to read John Gray's Philosophy and Cats because I'm not interested in philosophizing about cats." I mean, if I
that's
do, it's going to be about like how to deal with grief or things like that. It's not going to. And then some people will be like, "Cats are the preeminent philosophical animal," and you're like, "No, they aren't." Why the hell would you want to screw them up by making them philosophical?
yeah,
It's enough for them just to be cats,
yeah. Let them be cats. Let's recognize their cathood.
yeah, fuzzy and crazy, and a cool predator. One of the most successful predator creatures. If you just go by the sheer number of types of animals that they eat,
Mhm,
they're the only animal that's more successful as us. You know.
mhm, mhm. Maybe I'm kind of relating to what you said in terms of philosophy is one of the things that we do. I recently uh, reviewed a couple of best-selling books on my YouTube channel, and
Yeah.
the views usually go up. They're viewed more, even though funny enough, some people will just watch it and say, "Yeah, I knew it's not going to be a great book. I'm glad that you confirmed it." I was like, "Why are you paying attention to something?" I'm not talking to any particular individual, but
Yeah.
I think in relation to those videos, sometimes I think, okay, I'm glad that I'm cultivating a relationship with an audience, and maybe at some point I'll get them to read somebody else who is lesser known. Maybe they will watch another one of my videos. But what you alluded to is more general than that. You're saying maybe we will connect over philosophy as people, but eventually we will get beyond that and we will be connected as human beings,
That's
which
right. I
is,
mean, think about our conversations
yeah.
where, I mean, originally we were talking about things that were directly philosophical and very often like at the intersection of philosophy and psychology and academic life. And as we got to know each other, we talked about our families and um, event the woman who became your fiance and then your wife,
Mhm.
and the whole crazy story that there is to be told about trying to get back to Macau to teach during COVID. I mean, it's almost
Mhm.
Kafka-esque,
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
the maneuvers that you went through, and about like me and my kids, and all these and the move to a new office, and
That's right.
all of those things wind up being, what should we call them? Like, they're not just topics of conversation. They're ways in which you and I get to know each other, and our beings to some degree overlap. So even though you're up in Toronto and I'm down here in Milwaukee, I can be walking home and think, oh yeah, I wonder what Davood is
Mhm.
doing. It's an hour later there. It must be getting dark. It's not quite dark here. These are possible ways for our beings to intersect, if we want to get kind of metaphysical about it. But I think that's really important, and to make philosophy be like the one thread that does that just doesn't seem all that smart. Like, when I go to um the in-person stoicons, and it's been a long time since I've been to those, or other conferences. I go to this Aristotelian conference. One of the things that I really like is when we get to have meals with each other.
Mm.
And because we do chat about philosophy, but we chat about, oh, so what are you teaching these days? Or, oh, you bought a new house? Oh, what's that like? Or how are your kids doing? And all of these things that other people would be like, well, that's trivial bullshit. Why are you talking about that? You should be talking about Aristotle.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, but it's that stuff's important too.
Mhm. Yeah. In addition to having a richer human connection, it also reminds us that sometimes we sacrifice the
Mm.
rest of our lives for the sake of the career, path, or
Yeah, that's right.
what we
Yeah, yeah.
perceive to be the most important part of our lives, and therefore it merits sacrifice in other domains. But there must be limits to that. There must be limits to how much of the rest of our life we sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, and it also gives you a sense of like how lucky the people who would be placed in a position to do that. You think about like Husserl, for example. We have
Mm.
these Husserl archives, and it's lucky they survived because the Nazis wanted to destroy his stuff, and Leuven was good enough to be a home for them. And if you're a real Husserl scholar, what you do to establish your bona fides is you go and you study there. First, you have to learn his shorthand, and then you go and you find some manuscripts that nobody else has actually looked at in recent times, and you copy them out and you translate them and provide a commentary on them. And the reason you can do that is because there's like tens of thousands of pages of this stuff, but most of it's really, as far as I can tell, really boring things about a green ball with a red dot on it, and how you're perceiving both you're perceiving the front side and projecting the back side. And you realize this guy got to do that every morning, I guess for like 3 hours. Every weekday morning he would
Mm.
do that, and then he would meet with his students, and you're like, who the hell gets to do that kind of stuff?
Yeah, yeah. They
How
were his,
fortunate
yeah,
would you have to be?
exactly. Some people say those were his meditations, his version of meditations to engage in
Mm.
the activity of phenomenology. But then he recorded every moment of it.
Yeah.
Unlike,
And it had to be in shorthand because he's doing it so fast. There's so
that's right.
much content there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
content. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Um, so, shall we move to my next question?
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, because you are active on several platforms, as you mentioned in the beginning, I'm curious about how you deal with different platforms. How do you deal with, for example, X or Twitter differently compared to Facebook, and compared to both of those compared to YouTube? If you have different
Yeah.
mindsets, if you think that different things could be accomplished on each platform,
Well,
things like that.
that last one is really interesting, because I think that in a lot of cases, like what we see with Twitter or X, is a shrinking of what can be accomplished. Since
That's right.
Musk took over, because the whole like business model has changed, and there's so much chaos involved in it, and it's it's, whatever ethos there was in Twitter has been, I would say, completely undermined by Musk, his shift to the right, and clear favoritism, and involving himself. And I mean, now he's going to be part of Trump's cabinet,
Mm.
or he's going to have an appointment. I don't know if you can actually call him a cabinet person technically, but so I think Twitter, and by the way, I call it Twitter, and I'm probably always going to call it Twitter. Just like, I wonder if there's anything like this in Toronto. In Chicago,
Mm.
there's this iconic building called I think it's Willis Tower is what it's called now, but nobody calls it Willis Tower. It's always going to be Sears Tower. It will, I mean, maybe 100 years from now, people will call it Willis, or maybe it'll have changed to something else, but people just call it Sears Tower. And, we have a baseball stadium here that's officially American Family Field, but only out of towners call it that. It's either County Stadium or Brewer Stadium, depending on when you grew up. And I think that Twitter is like that as well. They really do want you to call it X, and hardly anyone does, unless they're sycophantic,
And even when we do, I always have the urge to say Twitter because people don't know what I'm talking about. When I say X could be anything, could be like the unknown,
Yeah. Well, and people still say tweet, right?
Yes.
Which doesn't make sense if it's X.
That's right.
People were joking around and saying that you would actually have it as a XIT, and then if you pronounce that like you do in Mandarin, well, that sounds like shit. Right? So you'd be putting out shits. Yeah. That didn't fly very much. But so what I end up doing, I would say much of what I'm doing is, and I do this across Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Mastodon. I put the same posts in each of them, and I just basically copy and paste. I do post more like joking or political stuff in Twitter, I would say, I certainly do that more than in LinkedIn, which is a little bit more professional. And I swear more often in Twitter. And then there's YouTube, and there I'm actually like producing videos, and those will get shared in all these other places. But I'm not radically changing. It's not like I have a Twitter strategy and a Facebook strategy and LinkedIn strategy. I suppose that would be smart for me to do because they are very different places, right?
Yeah, but it's not super clear how they should be treated differently. I mean, the boundaries between them are not clear cut. I would say on YouTube, you adopt the role of a teacher most clearly.
That's true.
On Twitter, you're more like backstage discussions.
Yeah.
Less formal. On LinkedIn, it's more like a corporate networking event, virtual networking event. For me, LinkedIn is the most awkward one. I still haven't really found a way to connect with it. But as I moved outside of academia, LinkedIn became more important compared to Twitter.
It's interesting with LinkedIn, less about my projecting myself onto it and more about other people reaching out to me. I get a lot of pitches because it is a business networking thing. And it's really kind of fascinating to me. I've been wanting to do some writing about this for a while. Like, I want to write an article called "No, I Won't Hop on a Call," because I get these people, and it's clear that they want me to sign up for some platform or something. And I used to actually hop on calls when I first got involved with it. And people would be like, "Oh, Reason IO, it sounds like a really cool business. Let's talk about what you do." And then I found that almost none of them had actually done any research. And there were two things that were happening. One was I was wasting my time just having a conversation with them because they had no clue about what business to business thing would be appropriate or applicable to my business. Because it's a weird business, right? It's not something easy to wrap your head around. And then I also found that I was giving away ideas for free that I should have been charging for.
Hmm.
And so, I actually tell people, listen, if you want to have a call with me, you've got to book my time because,
Mhm.
I don't put it this way, but I probably should. I'm pretty fertile in ideas and insights, and that's what you pay somebody to provide you with.
That's right.
So I get a lot of those things, and it's amazing how clueless so many of the people on LinkedIn seem to be. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it's because it's a business, corporate related thing. I do get pitches on Facebook, but it's more people trying to scam me more than anything
Mm.
else. Same thing
Mhm.
with Twitter.
Mhm. Mhm.
Some of them tend to be pornographic. Some of them are, they're doing some sort of long con where they're trying to start a conversation, and clearly they're probably a bot, not
Mhm.
even a human being. But
Mhm.
LinkedIn has a lot of people who want to have conversations with you, but the conversations seem like they don't go anywhere.
That's right. You mentioned they want to have like a B2B, maybe potential business relationship with you, but people who are interested in that usually they approach a type of business and they usually
Right.
project the type that, and you're not really a type.
Yeah.
You have a unique business setup. So do you have like categories that they pigeonhole Reason IO into, or they think that you're maybe like a
Yeah, but they're not things that I choose.
right, right.
They're things that are like pure fantasy on their part. So,
Hmm.
I mean, the closest thing would be like coaching or consulting,
I
right?
see. I see.
So
Yeah.
I do have some people who reach out, and it's usually like, "Hey, I can get you all these leads, and I took this person who was a total loser, and now they've got like $1 million in coaching business every year."
Of
And you're
course.
like, "Well, yeah, that's got to be fantasy." But I get a lot of them who try to pitch me services that I couldn't possibly use. And it shows you how lazy they are, because all they got to do is go to Reason.io's website, where at least on the current website, it looks like there's two people involved, me and Andy. Andy's not been involved in Reason.io for, over a decade. And actually Reason.io is now like a subsidiary of Reason at Work, which is just the two of us, right?
Mhm.
So do we need payroll software? I don't think so.
No.
You know, do
Yeah.
we need group insurance? No, because we don't have a group. It's just us.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so anybody who's pitching that sort of thing, you're like, come on, buddy. Didn't you even bother to I mean, if you wanted to try to work a lead or something, you probably should know something about that person. If I was the sort of person who would do cold calling, I sure as hell wouldn't be just going through the whole phone book and calling every single person. That's a waste of my time, right?
That's right. That's right.
And I get all sorts of pitches like that. You should try our new camera. And you're like, I don't do photography.
Mhm.
Here's some, video editing software. And okay, that makes sense because I do create videos, but clearly I know how to do it already and I don't need new software. And
Or
so it's
yeah. Or here's a software for keeping track of your employees,
yeah.
using IO employees in other countries.
Oh,
Yeah.
and the best is the ones where, because I am in education, I get a lot of pitches for things that maybe somebody at some of the places that I teach could possibly use,
Mhm.
but I'm so far out of the loop because I'm just an adjunct, right? So the provost of Marquette University is not going to take a recommendation for whatever management software they're trying to pitch universities. They're not going to take that from me. A philosophy adjunct says that this would be a good thing to check out. Oh, we better go check it out. I mean,
It's
it's so
unlikely.
so
Yeah.
I don't. There's like a lack of thinking things through on their
Right.
part. I'm sure that it's all volume and they're like, well, you know, 99% of the people that we pitch to are going to tell us to screw off or not engage with us at all. But maybe there's that one little person who will, and will make some money on that.
Mhm.
Maybe that's the business model, but it seems like a pretty stupid one to me.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I wonder how much maybe you relate to this. For me, when I'm on YouTube, when I do something on YouTube, I'm more likely to think of it as an end in itself.
Okay.
But increasingly, Twitter is just a means to an end. I'd like people to find me through Twitter and then to come and watch me on YouTube. LinkedIn
Yeah.
is definitely a means to an end, but it's interesting to me that sometimes a platform becomes more of a means and sometimes it becomes more of an end.
There are conversations, and it's usually not been on LinkedIn, but more on Twitter or Facebook that have
Mhm.
been interesting to either have like you post it and or it's in your page in Facebook, or you jump into some other conversation, and that can be worthwhile. That could be like an end because
Right.
you're not doing it to like achieve clout or
Sure. Sure.
something like that, and you're not certainly not making any money on it.
Yeah.
um, as a matter of fact, from a time perspective, these are all time sucks, and so almost the opposite of good means. But you can have that happen sometimes. But you can also have that happen with YouTube. You put a video out and people have interesting things to say.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I will say this, and I'd be curious to see what your experience is. So I will sometimes post the same thing on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube in the community thing, so I can get some feedback,
Mhm.
and it could be like a poll about like, hey, should I do this philosopher next, or it could be like some thoughts about something. And quite often, like, one of the platforms will hit, and I can't predict which one it'll be. Like, I'll get like dozens of comments on Facebook, but hardly anybody on Twitter has anything to say about it. Or, well, good example. So that Oxford professor who was saying like
Mhm.
Oxford is the only true home for philosophy.
Mhm.
I wrote, this is the dumbest shit I've seen all day. And I took, like a screenshot of his thing, and I posted it in YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Mastodon, and Twitter. And I got a few responses in Twitter. And usually Twitter is where the people get, kind of hot about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Almost nothing in Mastodon, almost nothing in LinkedIn. A lot of people weighed in on Facebook, and a few lesser people weighed in on YouTube. And it could have been like the time of the day, or who knows. But the same uh, provocation won't get the same results across platforms, I found.
Mm.
Now, have you found that?
To the extent that I've found it, I haven't found anything that is systematic. It might
Yeah.
be just a timing, or timing is a big factor, I think, despite the algorithms messing the timeline. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I can't think of anything else at the moment. The relationships are different. I, even though I have a social network, but the social network is present differently. Different portion of my social network is differently like present on these different platforms. So yeah, it's hard to say, but that's an interesting observation. And it's different. Is it different? Which platform it
Oh, yeah.
gains more attention each time? It's
And unpredictable, you
unpredictable.
know?
Okay.
Except for, I can say Mastodon probably is not going to get that much because I don't have a big following on there, because
Mm,
I got on there recently when people were leaving Twitter, and I was like, well, I'll check that out. Now it's like Blue Sky that people are moving to, but I debate about whether I want to get
mhm,
on something that would be yet another social network platform. I've got an Instagram profile, but I've never used Instagram,
mhm.
in part because I'm not a very visual person. And
Yeah,
Andy
same.
also told me, you're probably on enough platforms already. You don't need to add one more to your work.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So now that we talked about platforms, there's also the medium idea, because you write,
Mm,
you do audio podcasts, and you do videos. So
yeah.
I wanted to ask you how these different forms, different media influence what kinds of things you say. For example, I was uh, in a recent video, on YouTube, I heard from someone saying that when there's a time gap, for example, let's say I'm sending you a voice message on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
If I know that you're going to hear that message tomorrow or a few hours from now, not immediately, I tend to record a longer message.
Oh,
And on the other
interesting.
side, if I know that I won't be talking to you for a while because maybe I'm taking a trip or we won't have much contact for a while, and that will be my last message for some time. Again, the message length will increase,
Huh.
and I I relate to that because when I know that I won't be able to make a video after this, usually when the video that I'm recording ends up being longer.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
and I
interesting.
like, okay, it might be the like last one for a while, so let me put it this one, this reference to this reference to this. I'm reading this book these days as well. So, but that's just one way in which timing can affect us. Media, I think, also leaves traces of its limitations, constraints. So,
Yeah.
anyways, writing, audio, and video, how are they different for you?
Well, I will say this before we jump into that. I do some repurposing, like
Hmm.
like the core concept videos and the speculative fiction studies videos. I turn those into Sadler's Lectures podcast episodes. And I did that out of a sort of laziness. People were asking me, "Hey, why don't you do a podcast?" And I was like, "I don't know if I want to do a
So
podcast." And then
angry too.
yeah, they're like, actually one of the things that they would say is, I like your videos, but I have to stream them on my phone, and I'm using up my data. This is back when you had to pay
Mm,
for data,
right.
and I can't stream them everywhere necessarily. I got to have a connection. It'd be nice to have these in podcast format. And I was like, well, that I could actually do. I'm not like going to take the half hour Hegel videos because there's 370 plus of them, and they're very long, and they really benefit from having a chalkboard. I don't know how the hell you can make sense out of what I'm saying without looking at it, but the other stuff that's shorter, more focused,
Mhm.
okay, that can turn into podcast episodes, and that's actually good for me because I have to go back over it and edit all the ums and ahs and words that I've said twice and
Mhm.
long pauses out, and I improve the sound quality. And in doing so, I get to hear what I had to say about something, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Aristotle is talking about that. That's a good
Mhm.
point, because
Nice.
I've done so much that I forget what I've said. Here's another side note too. People will like write a YouTube comment on a video that's 10 years old, and they'll be like, "Hey, you said this, but this is clearly wrong." And I'll be like, how the hell would I know what I said in a video that I did 10 years ago? I've done 3,000 videos since then. At least
Yeah.
give me a timestamp so I can figure out what part of the half-hour video you're talking about, buddy.
Yeah.
It's as if they think that like you're there sitting behind the scene with every single video you've done, just
Yeah.
waiting to respond. But so coming back, I also take some of the videos, like if I've given a talk, I'll you take YouTube's transcript
Mhm.
and then turn it into like used to be blog posts, now it's like Medium or Substack,
Mhm.
which I suppose are blogs, right?
Yeah.
And I'll say, okay, in this conference presentation, here's the transcript of it. So there's a good bit of multi-purposing, I guess you could say, of the same content, which I think is fine.
So
It's it,
you don't often get to an instance where you say, okay, this may not work for this
oh,
medium.
sometimes I do, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just stay away from that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Um, like who wants with the core concept videos, and I've got like, I don't know, 1,200, 1,300 of them. I suppose there may be some people who want like cleaned up transcripts of them, but you can get the transcript right from YouTube,
Mhm.
So I don't see much point in turning those into blog posts. I mean, I
Mhm.
might talk about the same topic, right?
Mhm.
But I'll
Mhm.
talk about it in a writing way rather than a get up in front of the chalkboard kind of way, you know.
Right. 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 And you do
Um,
interact a lot with the chalkboard during the core concept videos.
yeah,
Just like it's a different dynamic. It's really like more like a classroom experience compared to a written piece. And
that's right. Yeah.
it's from the viewer's perspective. Me myself, just speaking for myself for a moment. When I am tired at the end of the day, I find it harder to go to Substack. I find it easier to watch something on YouTube. So if
Yeah.
if I have to choose, I will go for a core concept at the end of the day. Uh,
You know, I think that so Kant has some interesting speculations in the third critique
mhm.
about the the human form and why we are so drawn to it as an object of beauty.
Mm,
And I think there's something there. I think that there are videos where it's just like I think they call them video essays, and there's somebody talking, but it's all like pictures and stuff like that.
yeah,
But even
yeah,
then, it's often people. It's not just like
yeah,
landscapes.
yeah.
But I think that human beings really do enjoy watching a person, and it could be like the whole body, or it could just be like from the waist up, or even just a head.
Mhm.
Um, Leading them through stuff. Like people will watch somebody just reading a book aloud,
Yeah,
and they like that. So there's something about seeing another human form, and it doesn't, it doesn't work like, let's say you could turn it into like a cartoon. Remember when years and years and years ago they had those programs where it was like a computer generated voice, and you could have these cartoon characters. They were kind of 3D, and they'd be like different animals, and they'd walk up to each other, and you could put like a Socratic dialogue in.
yeah, yeah.
One
I
would be of
remember.
like a pig, and the other would be, I don't know, a dog. I don't think that was as successful because we're not that interested in, we actually want to see people or highly anthropomorphized animals,
Yeah, yeah.
doing it. So I think that kind of makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. The next place that my mind went after I listened to that was, people who have the second camera that makes them look like they are talking to somebody else who's there present in the room, and the audience
Oh,
becomes like a third party, even though nobody else is there. It's like
yeah.
suddenly I'm looking at this camera, and then suddenly you see me doing this, which is
Yeah, yeah.
a little strange for YouTubers, because we are all creating content with the assumption that we are turning the camera on. There's nobody else. I mean, the typical YouTuber is
Well,
turning
there
on
are
their own.
some who spend a lot of money with
That's
highly
right.
produced
Yeah,
videos,
that's true. That's true.
but usually they're not very good. Usually it's kind of
They
funny, and
look good.
I'm
They
not going
look
to. Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to say that this is a 100% correlation, but there does seem to be, like, the more attention and money that is put into production, usually the quality is lower, you
good.
know,
Mm.
in my experience. Um, and I don't know why that would be. I mean, there doesn't have to be a connection between that, but it just
No,
seems to have turned out that way a lot of the time in YouTube. So when something comes on and it's very slick, I'm usually like, well, this is probably going to be garbage.
me too. I have this. Yeah, the same bias, you could say, because
Yeah.
in my experience, people who tend to care about some aspects of their work, they tend to not care about the other aspects. So it's hard to find someone who cares equally about uh, all everything that they're doing, all aspects, both the
Yeah.
contents and the rigor that goes into the research, and the relatively superficial production qualities. Okay, great. So now, speaking of your recent move, you've moved into
Oh,
a new physical space, and
yeah.
since we are embodied in the topic of embodiment and embodied beings, embedded in environments, I was also curious if that has changed anything in your experience, in the qualities of your day to day creating, recording, thinking.
Yeah, very much so. And it's funny because it's one of those things where you're like, I should have done this years ago.
Oh wow.
So one of the biggest ones is creating a split between my work life and my home life. because my wife and I were both in a loft apartment that had 2 floors, and I want to say we had about 1,700 square feet of usable space. So I had, like, my own area for where this computer is and the chalkboard and all that. These bookshelves were all up in our bedroom, and I would sometimes, like, shoot in front of those, or meet with clients on my laptop. And I would sometimes go to other places to work. Like, there's a coffee house that I like to go to, and I would usually, like, read or write there. I wouldn't film there or anything,
Mhm.
but much of it was happening there. And so I could work basically at any time. And what that meant is I was working um, very often pretty late into the day. My wife and I would watch a show, and we'd both be on our laptops, also, like, answering emails or working on things, doing writing. Now, almost all of my work happens here.
Mhm.
And this is a great office. It's just the right size. It's interior, so you can't hear the trains, or when there was a rainstorm, you couldn't hear the thunder.
Mhm.
I got my lighting set up. It's easy to work here, and I can be here basically as late as I want to. I can be here on weekends and holidays and stuff like that. But where we sleep and where we have our actual meals together, because there's also, like, a kitchen up here, so I can eat and things like that. But I leave here at some sort of hour, usually around, like, 6 o'clock, sometimes as late as 7 or 8, and then I walk the about half a mile home. And then when I step into our much smaller now living space, I'm just there to do the domestic things, to hang out
Mhm.
with my wife, to maybe watch shows together, to eat, to catch up. And it's not like we don't talk through the day through texting or stuff like that, but we're having our actual life. And then I maybe take a bath, or don't go to bed, wake up the next morning, have some breakfast, and then I come here, unless I'm going to Marquette or Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. um, and I still do go to the coffee house from time to time, but that's more just like a treat.
Mhm.
So I didn't realize how I needed a work life split in order to have better work life balance.
Mhm.
And so for 9 years, we just, we didn't do that.
Yeah.
We did everything basically, except for, like, things going out somewhere to give a talk, right? Obviously, you're in a different space then. Um, but it was good, and we didn't, like, plan it out. We just ended up in a smaller space, and the reason why we got this was there wasn't going to be enough room for the chalkboard, and there's trains that go by our place.
Mhm.
And so that would disrupt filming. And so Andy was like, well, we'll get an office, we'll
Great
rent.
idea.
Yeah, I should have done this years ago. It's amazing, you know
Because
um
it's very easy to forget that our experience of any space is not just about what is actually currently happening in the space. It's also about what could
yeah.
happen in that space. All the potentials, just like a conversation. Like, it's not just the experience of the words we're actually saying, but all the horizons of possible things that we could, all the possible directions.
Yeah.
And a home slash office, when the two of them merge and there's no clear boundary between them, the
Another
potentials are
facet of
vast.
that is, and you and I are kind of in a similar boat as far as that. Um, if you're working from home, the one person who you're interacting with is somebody who you're very, very close to,
Mhm.
and you have a whole bunch of different connections. You can have intellectual conversations, but you also talk about, who's doing the laundry, or what are we eating for dinner, and stuff like
That's
that.
right. That's right.
Here, I interact with people. There's a woman who sits at the desk downstairs. I'm not sure exactly what her title is, but she's essentially like a concierge of the building, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And she's talkative, and I like chatting with her. And there's the cleaning people, and I like talking with them. But you only talk so much.
That's right.
You're not talking about things that are very deep and intimate. You're here to work, and so you chit chat with people, but it's at it's not necessarily just superficial because you are treating them as human beings, but
Mhm.
um, they're not coming. They're not. It's not as intimate, right?
That's
So it
right.
makes it easier to work. I think.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
Oh, so many times. Like this is not a complaint, but, but a lot of times, I like around like 4 o'clock, 4 p.m. My wife sometimes comes and says, like, what should we eat for dinner? And I'm like, it totally like it interrupts my flow of thought to such a degree that I have to like calm myself and say, oh, I don't. It's not. Doesn't matter right now. But of course, 15 minutes later, when I'm out of the work mode,
Yeah.
it matters a lot at that time. But but so it's the not having boundaries. It makes us unable to pay attention to things in the right way
I
because they don't. Yeah.
wonder with your cats,
Yeah.
right?
Oh.
I mean, cats don't respect boundaries at all,
No. No.
you know, unless
They don't
unless
think.
they've
They
been,
don't believe in them.
yeah. I mean, unless they've been abused or something like that. And you don't want them to respect boundaries
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
So I would expect that they could be significant distractions as well, right?
But they train us. I mean, they they
Yeah.
they train us to be okay to adapt to that to live with it as part of our environment. But work, you're right. Going back to the topic of work, it is a challenge. Maybe the work is the thing that requires the most amount of boundary. There are certain areas of life that maybe
Well,
having
that's an
boundary might
interesting
not be as
idea.
good. Yeah, but
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It also sounds like something where a person could reply, "Oh, see, you're prioritizing work above all else." But I don't
no.
think it's more like I need to have the boundaries so I can do the work, and then the work can be done well enough that it can be left behind.
And forgotten for a time. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah, interesting. Okay, no further comment on like the amount of space or windows in the office.
Well,
It,
it
those
there
are minor,
I
but
can't say this. So I do like the fact that I'm in an interior office,
Mhm.
but I have found that I at least once a day, if it's like a full work day, I have to get outside.
Okay.
And we're fortunate in that this is called the Global Water Center, and it's actually like just a block away from the Menominee River.
Mhm.
This part of Milwaukee, where we've got the Milwaukee and the Menominee rivers coming together and then going out into Lake Michigan. So there's a lot of beautiful green space around, and it's pretty cool to be here. So you get out and you walk around. Actually, the woman I was talking about who works downstairs, she sometimes walks all the way to the lake and
Mm.
then back again, for exercise. So when it gets really cold, I probably won't want to go outside so much, and it would be nice to have windows then. But
Yeah,
I'm not missing it much.
yeah, yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. So the space outside of the immediate space also becomes part of the daily experience.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Okay, the last topic, if you still have a bit of time,
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
also I wanted to ask you about this topic you brought up last time we had a private conversation. The topic of hype
Oh,
um, as a component of anything that we do, especially in the domain of content creation or online education.
yeah,
There is the thing itself, and then there is the hype around it.
yeah,
And knowing you, I would say my impression has always been that you ha- always adjust the level of hype to reflect the the thing that is being talked about, not to
yeah.
always have the maximum amount of always dial it up to the highest intensity.
Well, I couldn't because I don't like doing that. And I have gotten a lot more comfortable with, I mean, we can call it hyping or we can call it self promotion or calling people's attention to things. And
Mhm.
if it is really something that is valuable, you don't have to do much salesmanship. You just really need to explain why this would be good for people. So, like, if I design an online class and I only offer classes on stuff I actually know really well and think is valuable. So, just because I don't know some topic. So I'm not a political analyst, so I'm not going to like put together a whole bunch of videos on the recent election and what
Right.
what lessons we should take from it, because I'd be kind of proverbial talking out of my ass. And then I would have to hype it. I'd have to be like, "Oh, listen to Dr. Sadler, the brilliant analyst." And ideally, I'd have like graphics, and somebody else would be talking about it. You need to check this out. But I don't do a lot of that, and I do find, and I think you do too. I find that sort of um, what do we want to call it, hypesmanship. I find that kind
Mhm.
of repugnant, because you're in effect lying about the value of something. You're saying something is good when it's just maybe mediocre. um
What you mentioned, sorry to interrupt. What you
yeah.
mentioned is like, okay, leave philosophy to the side for a while, and then doing it, maybe a course on political analysis. There's another way of doing it, which some people do. They say, okay, what would Plato say about our recent
Oh,
election?
right. Yeah.
So, which is a stretching it. It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe giving Plato or any other philosopher the wrong kind of hype,
Yeah.
uh, which also does, I think, a disservice to the audience and to the everybody involved
Those
almost.
sort of things can be done well, but you really need to know both sides of the thing. You really need to know the philosopher well, and you really need to know the phenomenon well. And you probably have to talk about it in a way that's not going to be conducive to the sort of internet, this
Mhm.
is going to amaze you kind of hype out there.
So that's the
um
hardest option in a sense. That's the most challenging thing to do because you need
yeah,
to know both the current and the original source.
that's right. And you
Interesting.
also have to resist the temptation to try to simplify it and make it hyperbolic.
Right,
you know
right.
and hype can go positive or it can go negative. It can be like, this is amazing, this is going to like totally change your life for the better. Or it could be like, this is going to destroy all of us. And I think that people tend to gravitate to those, and unfortunately that's what attracts a lot of attention.
Mhm. Yeah,
um
yeah.
so yeah, I don't do a lot of that, although I've become, I think it's really important for anybody who's going to try to do philosophy or other, rigorous disciplines in a public way. You have to sooner or later become comfortable with putting your work forward and saying, you should check this out. This is worth, and here's why you should check it out.
Yeah.
That academics tend to assume that other people will automatically share an interest and an appreciation in whatever it is that they're bringing up, and you can't, right? I
Mhm.
mean, this goes all the way back to those service classes. When those kids walk into philosophy 101, first of all, they don't have a clue what the hell they're walking into, because we don't teach philosophy classes. They just know this is a required class, and they're like, why do I have to be here for this bullshit? So you've got to be able to like make a case to them that this is actually valuable for them.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think
Yeah. Having a moderate relationship with hype, the way you're suggesting, also allows us to not be overly impressed by
oh
the new methods and the new digital media and the new
yeah,
pedagogical concepts. Like there's so much hype around this concept of the flipped, yeah,
metacognition, right?
metacognition, the flipped classroom or a meta
Yeah,
classroom.
yeah,
These are not like, if you break down and pay attention to the details of what is actually involved in them, they're not that new.
yeah.
And
Or design thinking,
yeah,
is another good one, right?
yeah,
A
that's
lot of
right.
these things you say, well, what do you actually mean by that? And you're like, oh, that's what we were doing 20 years ago. We just called it this. The metacognition one was a really funny one because it's one of those buzzwords where people who are into it are really, really into it, and they're convinced that like this is going to fix everything,
This is
this
it.
explains everything. And people were commenting about this involves metacognition, you should check that out. And so I was like, well, what does it actually mean? Because to me, meta just means like cognition about cognition or thinking about thinking. Does it mean anything besides that? And they're like, no, man, that's exactly what it means. And I was like, well, who gives a shit about that? We've been doing that for thousands of years.
Yeah, and isn't it also already part of cognition? Cognition
Yeah,
already should include in it its own like self-referentiality, just like
ideally.
meta philosophy.
Otherwise, we've been idiots this whole time.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I would, in my thinking, I'm not that into it, but it's my prejudice against meta philosophy as well, which is another hyped up discipline. I think
Yeah,
maybe it emerged past a decade or so.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, when you first started talking about that, it reminded me of something. So I was walking and I was thinking about this the other day. How many educational startups have I been a part of? And they all engaged in hype. They were all going to like totally change the landscape of education. And almost all these companies no longer exist anymore because most of them failed, even though a lot of them had significant venture capitalist money.
Wow.
So one of them that's still out there, but just kind of limping along is called Curious.
Mm.
And they had this idea, it would be short, connected videos. And in the video player, you would be able to click on something and like a little quiz would show up at certain points. And you could include like handouts or links or things like that. So
Mm.
nothing super revolutionary. But, what would be revolutionary is they were going to use algorithms to say, well, if you like Jean Paul Sartre, you probably would also like something on Simone de Beauvoir.
Mm.
And there was a gamification aspect to it as well, where like it was almost like Trivial Pursuit. You could fill in your little, red, yellow, blue things for the different fields. And I remember, so they solicited me because I was on YouTube. And at one point, they even gave me $1,000 to, as an advance to develop a course
Mhm.
on philosophy of religion for them. And they had like advertisements on NPR. So you'd be driving along and they'd be like, curious.com, changing the world of education. And you're like, oh, that's cool. And then they ran out of money. And then they
Wow.
stopped publishing any new content. And they still exist, but it's a complete skeleton now. And
Mm.
I think there's like hundreds of these educational programs that or platforms rather companies that have done this sort of thing, and they all claim they're going to like totally, this is the new thing. And, you remember even before that we had those MOOCs, you know
Yeah.
and those were a complete bust except for programming. They worked great for that, but the completion rates for courses in the humanities were like 1%.
Mm.
I mean, what a great failure rate. And
Mhm.
everyone was like, "Oh, we got to change the education paradigm so it all becomes MOOCs now." And you're like, "Why? How stupid and gullible do you have to be to believe this hype?" Right?
That's right. That's
And
right.
so people have been doing this for quite a while. When television first came out, the idea was before it became all commercial, this will revolutionize education. People will be able to, watch educational programming in their homes, and maybe we won't need universities anymore.
Mm.
And nope, didn't turn out like that at all. So
Yeah. 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 And I mean, it would be nice to be in a state of mind where one doesn't need a huge promise, you know, because
yeah, that's
why is
that's
it?
that's good. Yeah,
Why is it that we are in a situation in thinking in such a way that only to borrow or to kind of joke around with Heidegger's statement, only a God can save us now.
yeah,
Why is it that only a godlike promise can promise itself to be a savior for us now? Or why do we need to be saved? Why, like, what's wrong with like a modest proposal about
that's
something that
right.
would
Yeah.
be, it would be pretty good.
Yeah, incremental improvements. I mean, they're just not flashy.
Hmm.
People seem much more attracted to the things that promise them like a big narrative that they're part of, you know.
Yeah.
But you're right. That is something that really ought to be explored. What is the motive that drives this?
Hmm.
Um, I suppose it's the sort of thing that attracts people to extreme religious and political movements or into lifestyle things that seem to be rather extreme. I'm going to do this and everything's going to fall into place, man.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I mean, people do that with marriage too. They're like, "Oh, I'll marry this person, then it's easy street from now on." And
That's right.
it ain't like that in any real marriage, right? I mean, unless you're marrying some, I don't know. I guess you could. The only time that could ever work would be like if you had a totally subservient AI that was a bot that you were marrying that was going to fulfill all your needs and desires. And I don't think they have anything like that
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
in the works. Although interesting hype about that, right?
That's right. That's
I don't
right.
know. Get yourself a robot companion; it'll be just as good as a real person.
That's right. That's right. Especially for people who just want this completely predictable. They think what they think to be the
Mm,
traditional mode of life, which is, I think it's a misunderstanding. But
yeah.
um, yeah. Anyways, is there anything that I didn't uh, bring up that you'd like to touch on before we conclude?
No, I'm just really happy to get to chat with you
Yeah, me
again.
too. It
We
was
always
great.
have great conversations.
Thank you. I'm glad you agree. It's not just me. Glad it's not. It's nice to hear that. It's mutual. Thank you very
Yeah,
much. Um, so we can conclude till next time.
sounds
I,
good.
which I hope. And
Oh,
happy
actually,
Thanksgiving.
before we end, is there anything like on the horizon as far as like authors you're reviewing or video ideas that you have or things like that that
Um,
you want to put out there that people
uh,
might be interested in?
yeah, that's a. I would say there's a dilemma that is on the horizon for me. So
Okay.
I recently talked about this uh, famous author Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, and his recent
Yeah.
book is *Nexus*. So one possible path, is to go more in a information path, talk about information networks, the social aspect of them, AI, which is very is discussed. I heard somewhere more than 100 papers are being archived or published per year per day on
About
AI.
AI. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not a surprise.
The other one is to go back to literature and just do these quiet discussions, occasional discussions on novels that I happen to be reading. But
Yeah,
yeah, both are good. Just a limited time, you have to choose. I imagine you also have these options that you have to continuously choose between, right?
that's right. Yeah. Except usually it would be nice to only have two to choose
Right.
between.
That's right. That's
I
right.
have too many balls in the air at any given time.
It's challenging.
Yeah.
It's challenging. I also wanted to wish you and Andy a happy Thanksgiving tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah,
Yeah. And since you've already had yours up there,
yeah, yeah.
hopefully
No
you
more
had a good
thanks.
one.
Yeah,
No more thanks. Yeah. Screw gratitude. We're done with that crap.
yeah, that's right.
Perfect place to end the
Yeah,
conversation on a bit of a joke. So
yeah, yeah.
so thanks so much for coming on, Davood.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully we will do it again soon.
Yeah.
Cool.